Like all stories, this story starts with a secret, my darkest one. It is not necessary that the secret I held so close to my chest is the darkest one for the world, only that it is so in my heart. 我叫李. If you do not read or understand Mandarin, just Plum will do. At least that's what Cole called me. And it's the only name that matters to me now. But it is also our family's name, one we share with Li Xiaolong. He is someone who has always mattered a great deal to me, since we are both caught between two worlds. We both share Chinese fathers and mothers from the Paperwhites, a connection I grew to understand is rarer than expected. This is a story of ambition gone wrong. I was warned and then warned again, and yet it didn't stop me. 'Cause maybe my story will help you, even in some small way. At least it's my wish that it will help another not stray so far from what matters. Someone once told me the only way to move on from something is to go through it. By the time I realized how true this was, it was too late for me. I only hope that this letter gets to you in time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Silas Polecats, and yet another review on this channel. The page that I just read out to you is the prologue of a book called Unwieldy Creatures by Addie Tsai. It is I do believe it's indie published, not small press published, but please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, by Jade Ibis Press. It was published in 2022, and I actually read it for university. I even wrote a paper on it, well, an essay to be precise, and I absolutely love it, which is why I wanted to present it to you today. So first things first, look at that cover. Like, after we've gotten past the first page, which, in my opinion, is a very intriguing start to a book, regardless of what we're going to talk about later on and what I thought of the book. Spoiler alert, I think it's great. That cover is absolutely stunning. There's a lot of writing on what you can assume is a person, or, you know, looks, I guess, somewhat fetus-shaped. Some of these are in English. For example, there is the quote, "The beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart." But some of it is also in traditional Chinese Hanzi, or characters. Like, for example, this Li right here is the name of our narrator and one of the protagonists of this tale. I could talk for hours about this cover. We actually did talk a lot in my class about this. But before I go off on a tangent, well, I already technically have, but to bring myself back from the tangent, Unwieldy Creatures by Addie Tsai, who uses any and all pronouns, by the way, so I will be trying to switch that up throughout the review if I ever mention her by pronoun, if not by name. Unwieldy Creatures by Addie Tsai is a Frankenstein retelling. There's a couple of reasons why this is super interesting. First of all, obviously, I think like retelling Frankenstein in general is really interesting, but what Addie Tsai did essentially with this book is they not only retold Frankenstein in a like modern approach, I would say, but Addie Tsai also very explicitly looked at gender nonconformity, because she is also a gender nonconforming, or well, you know, someone who kind of like gave the middle finger to gender, I feel like. There's a big possibility that Addie Tsai is writing from own experiences, as well as just experiences of the queer community in general. And there is this thing in academic circles, in case you have not yet encountered Frankenstein, which, by the way, is one of the funnier classics to read, in my opinion. I loved it. I had a blast with it when I read it for the first time, but that aside, there's a thing in academic circles where a lot of people start reading very queer themes into Frankenstein. There's a whole field essentially talking about queer monstrosity specifically, which is also what the course was on. And Addie Tsai's Unwieldy Creatures fits right into that whole academic context, in my opinion, which is one of the reasons I am so thankful that we read it in university, because I feel like Especially in contexts like these, it's very important to actually consider books that were not just written like 150 years ago. It would also be nice to look at somewhat more contemporary, in this case very contemporary literature actually. So for anyone who doesn't know anything about Frankenstein, very brief recap on what happens in Frankenstein, which directly relates to Unwieldy Creatures. Frankenstein talks about Victor Frankenstein, who is a scientist, I guess is the best word to put it, and he has this grand idea of creating a creature out of corpse parts, and to have that creature come alive, and to have that creature be the perfect man, essentially. Obviously, this goes horribly wrong. Essentially what happens is Frankenstein creates the creature, not thinking anything of what he's doing. He's very good at ignoring that. Once he does create the creature and it opens its eyes, he realizes what he's done and he, horrified, flees the scene. He jumps out the window, to be precise. Like, he doesn't even take the time to go through the door. It's honestly somewhat funny in its tragedy. The monster, thus abandoned by its maker, tries to basically find its way in society. It tries to see where and how it fits in, but the only person it finds solace with is a blind man who doesn't see the creature for the horrifying exterior that it apparently has. Once the seeing family of this blind old man, however, finds out about the creature, all of them are horrified and try to get the old man as far away from him as possible. Then he goes on a killing spree. There's no way of dressing this up any better. The purpose of that for the creature is to get revenge on Frankenstein. It doesn't really fully work, and the novel essentially ends with Frankenstein trying to find the monster, trying to kill the monster, not succeeding, and subsequently dying himself. And we never really know what happens with the creature. That's basically what Frankenstein is in like a minute or less, basically. Right, so the interesting thing about Unwieldy Creatures in relation to Frankenstein is that it follows the narrative structure of Frankenstein very closely. Not only do we have a scientific figure who is trying to create life out of not necessarily nothing, and in this case also non-body parts, thank God, but we essentially, to a certain extent of the story, follow Z, who is a kalalai, which means a masculine woman. This is one of the 5 genders that are present in Indonesia, by the way. Really fascinating topic. I highly recommend you look that up because it's really cool. And Z is trying to get in vitro gametization on the market. For anyone who also has no idea what these words mean, we have heard and are already using in vitro fertilization, which essentially means that you combine 2 gametes, so semen from the man and the egg from a woman, to create life. This doesn't necessarily have to happen during intercourse. This doesn't necessarily have to happen between 2 people who are also partners. So in vitro fertilization is giving a bit more freedom, I suppose, to the people who are trying to start a family. There's a lot of questionable choices that people have made with in vitro fertilization. This is just a very basic summary of what the process looks like. So it is legal. They have also done really weird shit with it, which is not recommendable. So should you want to go down that route, I highly recommend doing more research. However, in vitro gametization essentially means that you take a stem cell, which is something every single human possesses. Stem cells are the cells, or the undeveloped cells in our body, that turn into different cells, for example. In vitro gametization means you turn a stem cell into a gamete. So you don't even use a gamete in the first place, which essentially connects you to, you know, 2 people of the same sex and gender, or just people of the same sex who both have gametes that would not produce a child, be able to still have a child that carries genetic material from both of them. In vitro gametization is even more questionable as of right now than in vitro fertilization. I'm not saying it's good, I'm not saying it's bad, I'm saying it's questionable, because that's what science is when you haven't really figured out what to do with it. And this is the process that Z one of the characters in this novel, who is basically the stand-in for Frankenstein, is trying to do in order to create a child with her partner, who also happens to be a biological woman. So again, this is essentially the only way these two could reproduce, with the same genetic material of both of them combined in a child. And this is essentially Z's big goal in life, basically. And now, this already raises a very interesting question, in my opinion, on like queer people having children that nonetheless belong to them in some genetic way, I suppose. And what I really appreciated about this book is that it looked at the issue and didn't just condemn a single person. It didn't just necessarily condemn the practice in and of itself. It repeats over and over again that the process is there, and the process is scientifically accurate, and the process is trying to be as... It's trying to be as careful as possible. But it's also raising very real issues on how dangerous science can be. Because, as you might have guessed, because this is a Frankenstein retelling, Z's plan doesn't really work out in the way that it's supposed to. And the person created from the in vitro gametization, to be fair, there's a lot more going on there than just in vitro gametization. There's a lot in this book, but the person created from this is Ash, who identifies as a Bisu, which the book describes to be as something of a, like, metagender or intersex person, essentially. And Ash uses the pronoun dia, just for clarification. Ash is obviously the stand-in for the creature in Frankenstein, but there is another very interesting thing, or way in which Unwieldy Creatures mirrors Frankenstein, which is not only do we have Frankenstein, or a Frankenstein stand-in, in this case Z, and we also do not just have Frankenstein's creature, in this case Ash, we also have a narrator who ties all of these stories together. If you were listening closely to the first page, the narrator of this entire book is called Lee, or Plum, as she later on is fine if people call her that. And there is actually a very interesting thing, which I don't think people who haven't picked up Frankenstein know. Frankenstein itself, like the book itself by Mary Shelley, is told by a third person. I always forget his name because he's quite literally present for approximately 3 pages in total. And like, the book is not very long, but still, that's like 1% of the book, essentially, right? Because the entire book is not necessarily just Frankenstein telling his story and then the creature himself telling his story as well. The stories are being told to someone present in the book. Because Frankenstein, at the beginning of the book, and then subsequently at the end as well, this is where he dies, gets found in the Antarctica by a man who goes on a ship cruise there. I think he's trying to find something, if I remember correctly. And the entirety of the tale of Frankenstein and his creature is a letter this man writes to his sister. Now, if you were paying close attention to the first page that I read out, Lee is also writing a letter. But the difference between Frankenstein and Unwieldy Creatures is we never find out whom exactly Lee is writing to. But yet another key difference, despite the fact that overall the, I would say, cast of characters is essentially the same as in Frankenstein, as well as, by the way, the moment where Ash's chapters come in, where Dia gets to tell us about Dia's experience of the world, and also how Dia grew up. They appear in almost exactly the same spot as the creature chapters do in the original Frankenstein. Despite all of that, a key difference here is that Lee, so the narrator of the entire story and the person who is framing everything that we experience in this book, is also taking a much more active part in the storytelling. Not only is she telling us Z's story, and then subsequently Ash's story as well, she is also telling her own story. She's telling about her own experiences of being half Chinese, half white. She's telling us about her own experiences of discovering that she's queer, running away from home, finding someone she loves. Her name is Cole, by the way. And she's also telling us about how she met Z in the first place and how she and Z interact. So instead of with Frankenstein, where the narrator and Frankenstein himself are essentially very much disconnected from another, and the only reason they are interacting in the first place is because Frankenstein just happened to fall on his boat and be fished out of the icy waters by this man. Lee and Z in this tale are very much connected to one another. Not just because of how they meet, which is, if I remember correctly, in a lab, aka the lab that Z has in the first place, where Lee is actually working at some point. Not only that, and not only the fact that Z chose Lee to tell her story to, but also later on, they have a lot more of a connection there. I don't want to necessarily spoil everything in this book because I definitely think that everyone who hasn't read this yet should absolutely check this out. It is a fascinating book. There is some triggering stuff there, definitely, which I want to get to in just a second, but essentially Lee and Z have a lot closer relations with each other than the narrator of Frankenstein and Frankenstein himself, which I found very interesting because that is basically the big point, or one of the big points, where Unwieldy Creatures completely deviates from the source material, as in it gives a third character the chance to not just be the framing device of the entire story, but to be in the story as well, to be an active component of the story. And it very much changes a lot of the dynamics present in, like, this Frankenstein tale, essentially. Because the original book basically gives the reader the chance to judge for themselves whether or not they think Frankenstein or the creature are at fault here. And in my opinion, the answer is yes, but that aside. Whereas Unwieldy Creatures has Lee pass active judgment on both characters, both Z and Ash, so the Frankenstein stand-in and the creature stand-in, which again, is a deviation from the source material, but it also changes the atmosphere of the novel very much. I still think that Unwieldy Creatures is very, not necessarily morally grey, but Unwieldy Creatures is trying very hard to represent a very difficult subject, which in this case is in retrogrammatization. It's founding, quite literally founding a family when you are queer, and when you might be unable to conceive children the quote-unquote natural way because of how your biology is made up. Like, it's not a crime to say that. I feel like this is very important to point out to some people. It's not a crime to say that you are unable to biologically conceive a child. What is not exactly great is that some things are valued, you know, intrinsically more than others. And I feel like Unwieldy Creatures is opening a very interesting pathway into talking about this, obviously through a fictional lens, and as I said, there's a bit more going on there than just the process of in vitro gammetization going wrong. So, you know, there's that, and we hope that that stays fictional, though. You know what? Looking at some of the choices some of these characters make, I'm not entirely sure if it... Anyway, let's just leave that aside, shall we? Right, so I said that one of the key differences between Unwieldy Creatures and Frankenstein is that the third figure, so the framing device in Frankenstein, actually gets a voice here that not only changes the course of the narrative, but also on how you view certain of the characters. But there's another very big difference in this book, apart from obviously the fact that this is set more or less in our world, whereas Frankenstein is set in the 1800s, so I don't really know what we're supposed to expect from that. Another key difference here is that not only does the creature stand-in, so Ash, get a voice, but Ash also gets to explicitly gender DSelf. This is very important because the creature in Frankenstein never gets to do that. In fact, the creature in Frankenstein, which is why I keep saying the creature, doesn't have a name. There's a common thing of people calling Frankenstein's creature Adam, because there's a very famous line in the book that essentially says that Adam was left by his creator, as in the creature was left by Frankenstein, but it's not his name. He doesn't have one. And he technically doesn't even have a pronoun. I'm fairly certain that a lot of people have talked about the usage of pronouns in Frankenstein, a lot more people that have a lot more brain cells than I do right now. But the gist of it is, the creature in Frankenstein never gets a choice in anything. Neither in its creation, nor in its use of pronouns, nor in people gendering it or not gendering it. He gets nothing. His existence is basically just to be a man-made thing, if you want to be really brutal about Frankenstein. That's his purpose in the entirety of the book. It's also why I keep switching between he and its pronouns. I'm not saying that its is necessarily incredibly dehumanizing, because I know a lot of people, especially from the queer community, find comfort in that pronoun. But I am saying that in this case, it is specifically because Frankenstein keeps denying his creature any agency. And to an extent, so does the book. And now the interesting thing about Unwieldy Creatures is that not only does Ash get a voice, like the creature technically does, because again, the creature tells Frankenstein his story on what happened to him after Frankenstein left him. You know, seconds after the creature essentially opened its eyes. Great parenting there. Not only does Ash get a voice, just like the creature in Frankenstein, Ash then goes on to explore the agenda. Ash goes on to explicitly point out the agenda. I'm not kidding when I say that Ash explicitly talks to, within the book, Z, but outside of the book, the person reading it. There's a very important line here, which is just... And so I tell you now that my name is Ash, and I am a Bisu, and I hope you can understand why, in all future cases, both within my company and beyond it, I want to be referred to by the pronoun dia. And again, first of all, this is a pretty big deal simply because characters being able to explicitly define themselves is a big deal, regardless of what people think, in my opinion. But in general, I think it is a big deal that characters get to gender themselves on page, explicitly, referring to themselves in explicit gender terms that they have chosen for themselves, as Ash has chosen for Dia's self the pronoun Dia, and also the gender label Bisu. So, this is something the creature in Frankenstein consistently gets denied. The creature in Frankenstein gets denied of its humanity, the creature in Frankenstein gets denied of a name, it gets denied of pronouns. I mean, to be fair, in the 1800s, the he might have just been incredibly generic because that's what people did back then, especially in academic circles. But it warmed my heart to be able to see this in Ash, and I think this is yet another point where this book very much deviates from Frankenstein purposefully. Because the entire point of this, in my opinion, is to rephrase what monstrosity means to people. And I think it's such a fascinating concept. And I also I really just love the fact that we don't not only have chapters from Ash's perspective, but that we have chapters where Ash explicitly tells us what Dia identifies as, where Dia comes from. And it's not only that, but Addie Tsai also uses intertextuality, which basically means two texts interact in a certain way, because they keep on dropping books that Ash reads to, you know, further Dia journey on Dia gender experience, and just Dia process of finding Dia self, I suppose. So there's a lot of books in here that you can actually look up. I did look up some of them, and they're fascinating. Funnily enough, Ash also reads Frankenstein, so there's that. I know that this feels a bit more that I'm talking more about Frankenstein than I'm talking about Unwieldy Creatures. I promise you this is partly because I don't want to spoil the entire book. There's some really cool stuff happening in, like, basically, like, around here. Because, like, the first parts of this book are very much basically just a retelling of Frankenstein. That's more or less it. Again, there's a lot more nuance culturally speaking, partly because Addie Tsai is also a writer of color, which, you know, it's even greater that you know, writers of color get the ability to express themselves through art like this. I just love it. I cannot say this enough times. I love that for every single one of them. So there's a lot more exploration of culture, there's a lot more exploration of not just queer people being denied rights or being oppressed, but also queer people of color specifically. Having that intersectionality there in the book is a very big theme, which obviously is not part of Frankenstein. But after a specific point, which is, as I said, right about here, the book also changes very much in how it approaches the ending. Because as I said, the tale of Frankenstein doesn't necessarily end on like any kind of specific note. We have the creature going on a rampage, we have people being killed, especially people from Frankenstein's family, because that is the creature's goal. And then we have Frankenstein swearing vengeance, going after the creature, and then subsequently dying. That's the end of Frankenstein. Spoiler alert, I guess. And the reason I keep going on about this is because I feel like Unwieldy Creatures is not complete, or me talking about Unwieldy Creatures is not complete without me talking about Frankenstein. Because this book is the Frankenstein retelling, in my opinion. I know that there's a lot more out there. I've read like 2 or 3 other ones as well, and they're good and they're great, and some of them are really, really fascinating as well, but I feel like the reason Unwieldy Creatures is so special to me when it comes to the connection to Frankenstein is because this is a retelling. Like, there are quotes from Frankenstein in there, which I love. We love intertextuality very much in this household. The entire narrative structure is essentially the same, while putting a lot more emphasis on the narrator and the framing character of the story, basically. There are so many themes from Frankenstein that are just realized slightly differently in this novel, because of course they are, because we're talking about like an almost 200-year difference between the writing process of these books. So, of course there's going to be a lot of differences, but I feel like Unwieldy Creatures takes Frankenstein and just rewrites it in a different setting and with a different focus. And I know that sounds very vague, but I feel like if you try and read these side by side, you're going to fully understand what I mean, which is me trying to sell you both this book, but also this book in comparison to Frankenstein. I don't really mind, or that's the wrong way to say it, I don't really care what your opinion on Frankenstein is, but I do think that if you read them side by side, you're going to appreciate Addie Tsai's craft a lot more. Like, this book is great on its own. I'm not trying to say that this book cannot stand on its own without a work from almost 200 years past that people are still praising as so incredibly great, because I mean it is. It also has its faults. It is 200 years old almost, so of course it does. But I'm not saying that Unwieldy Creatures cannot stand on its own, but I am saying that it is the Frankenstein retelling, in my humble opinion, and I am in awe of what Addie Tsai did with the original book and how she managed to squish it into a form that they could then do something with, that they could then comment on. I'm also, in case my enthusiasm wasn't obvious, I want to write my bachelor's thesis on this, so wish me luck for that, I suppose. But yeah, general consensus, I've really, really enjoyed this book. I really, really love this book. I think there's so much going on here that you could talk about for ages. There's also the fact, for example, that this book is not just written in a, Western alphabet, is that what you call it? I think it is. There's also quite literally Chinese Hanzi scattered in here, which is relating back to Li's culture and Li's background, essentially. And I think this is a really cool idea because, like, we have footnotes that explain what the words mean. In case you can see that, ignore my notes. We have footnotes, but the footnotes stop for specific words at some point. So some words get repeated over and over again, and the footnotes stop, which I think is great, because what Addie Tsai does with this is they do give you the opportunity to understand what they're talking about at first, but after that you have to keep up yourself, and I think that's a great, it's a great way of doing this, in my opinion, and it's such a fascinating way of showing Li's history, essentially, by just having both the Western alphabet as well as Chinese Hanzi on the same page. It's great. It's fascinating. I really, really love it. Yes. I very briefly, I remember this. I'm sorry, this is very rambly, but this book is just amazing, okay? I remember saying something about trigger warnings. Okay, so going into this, first of all, as I said, this is a Frankenstein retelling. So it is, I would say it counts towards the gothic genre. So there you have it. There's a lot of queerphobia in this book, both implicit, as in, you know, people like reminiscing about it a bit. There's also very explicit queerphobia from different characters that different characters experience. There is very much purposeful misgendering going on every once in a while. There is dubious science, dubious at best, going on every once in a while. There's like, I guess you could call it pseudo-incest, or the attempt of pseudo-incest. It's not... It's very hard to say this without spoiling it fully, but there's pseudo-incest going on, okay? So it's a theme in there. There's also just discrimination in general going on there. Homelessness, like characters being homeless, characters running away from home, characters being, in some cases at the beginning of the book, for like the background story, so some of them literally being taken away from home. There's abusive marriage and abusive father-children relations. I think that's covering most of my bases here. So keep that in mind. I like for people to go into books prepared, because I don't want you to read a book and experience something that genuinely triggers you. I don't think that is the point of literature, and I don't appreciate that. So I really like it when someone can give trigger warnings. I probably have forgotten some because it's been a while since I read this book. If I have, and you happen to find them somewhere online, please feel free to post them in the comments. Just, you know, put something like, here's some more trigger warnings for the book in front, so people who don't want to see the trigger warnings can just skip that. Because, you know, everyone should have a choice in whether or not they want to engage with trigger warnings or not, because, you know, choices are great. We love choices in this household. I guess, like, maybe... you could probably also say coercion and, like, gaslighting is definitely something that's also going on in this book. This is a bit of a spoilery one, but like, again, if you don't wanna hear about this, just skip a few seconds ahead or something. But death at childbirth. There we go. That's also something that happens in this book. Again, please be aware of this when you go into this. If any of this is like something that severely triggers you, please do not feel forced to pick this book up. For anyone else who wants to experience this book, I highly recommend it. I do encourage you to read this with Frankenstein. You don't have to though, but like, it made me appreciate this book a lot more. Which sounds bad, I'm so sorry, but like, it made me appreciate what Tsai was doing with the structure, and it made me appreciate what they were thinking about when it came to doing a legitimate retelling of something. Because I feel like the idea of like a mad scientist who wanted to create life and then regretted that choice immensely is something that has been taken up by literature countless times, and not always necessarily 100% relating back to Frankenstein. And Addie Tsai did a lot more than that, and I just want people to appreciate that, and I feel like you can only appreciate that fully when you've read Frankenstein at some point in your life. So there's that. It's a great book on its own. The craftsmanship is extraordinary when you know what it retells and what it works with. I think that's the best way to put this. Anyway, this is very rambly, I'm very sorry, but I really, really love this book. I really want more people to experience it, especially because we love supporting smaller creators, we love supporting writers of color, we love supporting queer writers of color. So if any of that checks off some mark, please feel free to pick up this baby right here. It's really great, and yeah, that's all I can say about this book. Right. If you enjoyed this rambly mess of a video, please feel free to like this video, and feel free to tell me in the comments down below, have you read this book, or have you read Frankenstein? What is your opinion on Frankensteins, and also retellings in general? Like, what's your stance on that? Do you like it when your retelling is vague and just picking up broad ideas of something? Do you like it when you can see like a very specific scene that the retelling is doing exactly like the original, but putting like a tiny spin on it at the end. Do you not like retellings whatsoever? Tell me in the comments down below. And also, if you haven't read this book yet, tell me if you feel like picking it up now. I definitely say you should, but you know, we all have very big TBRs. It's fine. But yeah, I hope that you've had a great reading experience so far. I hope that you're having a great reading experience after this, and I will see you soon.